Hello everyone, welcome to the new series of Drishti IAS. I am Ritu and today we are going to discuss very important topic which is reforms in multilateral development banks, and this topic is important from GS 3 perspective. So before moving to the points of discussion, first of all we will know a brief background about MDB. So what is this MDB? So this MDB has been started after the Second World War, when all the nations, especially the European nations, were in the fractured state, and especially the nation who were colonized by the European nation, they were also in the fractured and their condition were very miserable. So in order to support all those nations, these MDBs has been started. So this is the brief background about the MDBs. So moving to the points of discussion part. So first of all we are going to discuss the news, and then we are going to discuss about MDB, a brief intro of MDB, and then why reforms needed, and then in the context of India, that how MDB is supporting India, and then practice question for prelims and mains. So moving to the news part. So there are two news associated with multilateral development banks. The first news is that in G20 summit, there was a G20 external group decided, and the external group consisted 11 members. And for what purpose this G20 external group has been decided? In order to strengthen the MDBs or in order to reform the MDBs. So these are the two news which is associated with the multilateral development bank. The second news is that recently we have seen that in Morocco there was a annual meeting of IMF and World Bank this time. So in that annual meeting, they had also decided that what reforms required for the IMF and the World Bank. So these are the two news which are associated with this thing. That's why we are discussing this topic. So moving to the next slide. Next slide is about that what is MDB. So MDB is an international financial institution which involves two or more than two countries. And for example, we can see that World Bank is an example, IMF, Asian Development Bank, New Development Bank. So all these are the example of the MDBs. And what it does, so it does basically, it provides loans and grants to member nations, and generally it is a platform for the lending pool. It means that developed countries provide lending loans to the developing nation, and the developing nation borrow loans from the developed countries. So it is a lending platform for the developing countries in which these two nations exchange their loans to each other. So this is the basic job of the MDBs. So moving to the next slide. Next slide is about that why reforms needed. So these are the very good institution and they support various low economic nations, the middle income nations. So why reforms needed for these nations? So first of all, we have already discussed that these schemes have been started after the Second World War. And it's been like almost 7 to 8 decades that this thing has been not reformed. So these things are not inadequate. They are very also outdated. So in order for the outdated thing, they require new reforms because there are new contemporary challenges for the different nations, and they were not meeting the demands of the contemporary problems. It means that since seven decades back we have a different kind of the problem, but right now we have a different kind of the problem. Earlier there was no climate change issue, there was no much discussion on the climate change, there were not much discussion on the poverty and other development program. Earlier there was no digital economy kind of thing, but right now we have these kind of the contemporary issues just like digital economy, climate change. So all these sounds very outdated in terms of all these things. So that's why the IMF, World Bank, Asian Development Bank and European banks, so all these banks needed different kind of reforms because they were not meeting the demand of today's nation. And especially there was a huge gap between developed nation and developing nation. And what we have seen that of course they are funding the developing nation, but their funding was not in an appropriate manner. So suppose that India requires funds for a particular project or for a particular scheme, but that were not aligned with the MDB's demand. So that should be aligned manner, and whatever the India is requiring, whatever the African nation is requiring, whatever the Middle East nation are requiring, so that should be aligned with the national demands of the nation. So for all these things the reform is needed. And the second most important thing is that it also lacks transparency and accountability, because we have seen that most of the time it has favored the middle income countries. So third world countries had left out, they felt left out, And suppose that if developed countries lending the loans to the developing countries, so they give loans to the favorable countries which they have a good relation with. So in this way there is an inappropriate behavior which had been found into this kind of the organization. That's why reforms it needed into the MDBs. So this is the reform part. Moving to the next slide. Next slide is about that what is the Indian context regarding this thing, that how it had helped India. The MDBs like the World Bank, the IMF and Asian Development Banks and other banks, how they had helped India into their development. So first of all we will discuss by that, the World Bank had lent India worth $97.6 billion for various projects, and most of the projects were related to the infrastructure, energy, transport. So for all these things India had borrowed these money from the World Bank. And for Asian Development Bank also it had borrowed like $59.7 billion. So what we can see here that they had given money for India for their developmental projects. And just like that few other banks had also, suppose that European Investment Bank has also contributed to India and they had also given 4.5 billion. And then Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank had also given 9.9 billion money to the India, and they all had contributed in the development of India. And that's why we can see that there are various transport projects which has been developed with the help of all these banks. So in a way India had taken various advantages from all these banks. But what is the role of India here? So recently we had concluded G20 summit and India has regarded itself as a voices of the global south. So being a voices of the global south, it's responsibility of India that the other nation, especially the third world nation, especially the low income nation, should get loans and financial assistance whenever they needed. So in that their need, these kind of the financial assistance are very much required for them. So it's responsibility of India to maintain the transparency and accountability into all the MDB system. And it's also responsibility of India that there were various things which had happened in the past and we have seen that African countries were left out. So being a voice of the global south, and India had also admitted African Union into the G20 nations. So being the partnership with the African countries, it's responsibility of the India to assist them and to help them into the decision making. Most of the time what we have seen that only developed nations are taking the decision making process. They are only participating in the decision making process. So it's the responsibility of India to ensure that developing countries and the least developed countries should also take their participation in the decision making process. So moving to the next slide. Next slide is that practice question for prelims. So this question has been already asked in 2019. So the question is, with reference to Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, consider the following statement. And the first statement is AIIB has more than 80 member nation. The second statement is India is the largest shareholder in AIIB and AIIB does not have any members from outside Asia. So here they are asking the correct statement. So you have to answer this in the comment section. Moving to the mains part. So the mains part is, what are the main opportunities and challenges for multilateral development banks to mobilize resources of a country and a partnership for development, finance and assistance? So here what you have to do, that you have to give brief background about multilateral development banks. So we already had discussed that they had been erupted after the Second World War. And for what they had been erupted? So they had been erupted for the financial and economic assistance to all the fractured nations who were highly affected from the World War. So these are the basic aim of all the MDBs. And what reforms do we need at this point of time? So earlier they have this financial assistance from financial assistance. Now its job is to know the analytical perspective. It means that the financial assistance and the economic assistance should be given to those countries who are in the dire need, and it should not be just related to the transport or infrastructure. It should also contribute to fulfill the SDG, which is Sustainable Development Goals of all the nation. It means that they had to also contribute for the social issues just like gender inequality, child marriages, child beggary. So for all these kind of things, the MDB should extend their support, not just for the development or infrastructure or energy needs. For the social needs, we need their reforms. So these kind of the financial assistance we needed from the this MDBs. And what are the opportunities they have? So in the past also we have seen that they were the voices for the poverty and income inequal countries. So it's their responsibility, and they can become a vital role into this, that they can eradicate poverty from this all over the world. So they have this kind of the opportunity. The second big opportunity they have is like the climate change, because earlier there was no issues on climate change. There was issues on the climate change, but that were not widely discussed. But right now we have led so many conferences, so many seminars related to the climate change, and the climate change is the need of the hour. So it's very responsibility of the all the MDBs to tackle all the climate change problem, and they had to also fulfill the SDG goal, which is related to the climate change problems. So in this way they have this kind of the opportunity. The third thing is that they can also empower the third world countries and the least developed countries. So we had already discussed that the least world countries does not have much opportunity to share their ideas, share their innovations, share their productivity and production. So in order to find out all the resources, it's the responsibility of the MDBs to include least developed countries in the decision making process. So there should be no unequal distribution in the power structure system. On the other hand, MDBs structure is very bureaucratic in nature, so that restricts the MDBs development and their horizon. So that bureaucracy needs to be stopped. So in order to all these things, all these reforms are needed, and there are so many opportunities for the MDBs. So MDBs has to remove all the challenges and then reform itself. So I hope you like this lecture. If you have any queries related to this lecture, kindly ask in the comment section. Thank you.